stand up before the mic. If you wish, you can do it with page up and page down. Okay, let's wait for the audience.
Yes.
Everybody will be back with the coffee.
I was in Kazakhstan and then in Spain.
Okay. And please remind me the title of your book. Kazakhstan. Okay. Actually, I ordered this book for our library, but I had no chance to read it as of yet because there is a long queue of books I have to read. I realized that, okay, the library notified me that the electronic access was activated, but I had no chance to read it as of yet.
Yes? Sorry. Can I just... I'm finished. Yes?
Oh, thank you, dear. Oh, thank you. Email from the journal editor, and he sent me comments of reviewers, which are excessively long. It's about 12 pages of comments. I not yet read these comments. 12 pages is something, but I realized that the size of comments is overall, so 3 different reviews, is comparable with the size of articles.
Where was this?
This is a journal called Russian Colleges. Sort of first presentation of the article, but it's good to get some feedback, some questions, some of them useful for clarifying some issues, and let's see what reviewers wrote.
Whenever you write on Russia, everybody has opinions, right? 12 pages.
Yeah, that's true, because people probably don't know much about Kazakhstan. They need some sort of interest and expertise. But everybody has his or her strong opinion about Russia. Well, let's see what reviewers wrote.
No, Kazakhstan, we get a lot of comments, but not 12 pages. I think the biggest I've ever had was 7. But that's a lot. And it's so, they probably told you, you should cite what you give. It would have been really funny.
Yeah. Good afternoon to everyone. Please come on in and take seats. There is plenty of seats in the front rows, so come on in, please. We will start in a minute, so please take your seats. Yeah. Welcome to the second plenary session. We had an excellent start during the morning session with 2 presenters on general framework for analysis of authoritarianism. And now we will turn from the global level to the level of everyday authoritarianism. And it is a pleasure for me to introduce our presenter, Diana Kudaibergen. Diana started her education in Kazakhstan, then in Spain. Then she got a PhD in Cambridge and published her dissertation-based book, The Kazakh Spring, in Cambridge University Press early this year. And now Diana is working for the School of Slavonic and East European Studies in the University College London. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Diana. You're very welcome.
Okay, I'll probably stand up. I hope it's not, an issue. Yeah, thank you so much, and I wanted to say gratitude for the organizers for inviting me as a keynote. I think there's a little bit of confusion. I just started a job at UCL. I'm very, proud, new UCL person as a lecturer in Central Asian politics and society. But before that, I was in Cambridge for a very, very long time as a lecturer in political sociology. And that's, I think, is my first caveat, is that I'm really trying very hard to be transdisciplinary, because I think that's where the real juice is. That's how we need to be. That's where the creativity flows. But I have my own flaws as such, and political sociology is kind of like engraved at the back of my brain. So again, I always joke that it's not contagious, but political sociology has its specific ways of imprinting itself in the way I write and think. But again, as I say, I try to learn a lot from the interdisciplinary approach. I've been thinking about this keynote because I think having just published my book, it's actually not on my dissertation, it's on something related to that. My dissertation was on nationalizing regimes in Baltics and Central Asia, but the Kazakh Spring kind of was a very fantastic book to write, because it's based on so many voices of the activists, and it has the main puzzle of how and why social movements and protest movements are possible under a dictatorship. And I'm native of Kazakhstan. I've been born and I lived through a dictatorship, so I quite sympathize with the cause of my respondents and how they responded to it. But today I thought, I will try to complement both a little bit of the book. We will have a book discussion on Friday, so that's, if you're interested to hear about that, you should come to that. But I wanted to talk also about the ongoing conundrums I have in doing precisely that, because as a scholar of initially nationalism, then becoming a scholar of authoritarianism and a student of regimes, it's an ongoing conundrum of how we understand things, the way we understand them. Again, I was told by my friends, I prepared a speech, which I usually don't do, but I was told from my friends that the best advice I got was to start with a good puzzle and then tell good stories, so to become a good storyteller. So I'm following this advice as much as I can. My puzzle will form of 3 particular questions, and then I will try to present an ongoing framework I'm doing right now in my studies. So I'm very interested, and I've always been interested in how do citizens in authoritarian context understand the realities they live in, how do they make sense of these realities, that is defined by everyday authoritarianism, and whether they take any active part in what authoritarian regime essentially becomes. And my argument is that they do. It's a two-way communication between regime and the society. And I think there's a lot of literature. I'm following this panel from Jennifer Gandhi, whose book on political institutions really influenced me in the grad school. And I think it's very, very clear that there is a consensus in the field that authoritarian regimes do create their own institutions, and there are authoritarian practices and tactics, and they influence the citizens in authoritarian context through the interplay of these institutions and practices. But for me, the puzzle beyond that is also to understand why, in certain contexts, the authoritarianism gets normalized, why and how it becomes mundane part of everyday life, where people say that nothing can be changed, where people use certain words, and I'm going to talk about words today, that basically normalize this particular status quo. And I think when we, again, there's going to be a bit of provocation, so that's another caveat I should be saying, that it sounds strange to say that people normalize authoritarian rule. I don't say that we need to blame the citizens for doing that. I'm just saying that authoritarian rule can be so violent that actually the normalization is also the continuation of this violence when people, whether are aware of it or not, that they're normalizing and keeping the regime in place. But also, I think the important question is that dictators don't rule alone. And when we're talking about regime, we need to expand this definition beyond just the political leader and beyond his inner circle. But we also need to understand, as I say, this two-way communication between the regime and society. Right? And my disciplinary or methodological work stems from the need to theorize with the field. So I'm not working on Central Asia, I'm not working on Ukraine, I'm working with Central Asia and with Ukrainians or Central Asians. And my interlocutors become active creators of the theory and conceptualization that I'm writing about. So today I want to focus on three interconnected concepts that I'm developing in my current work. That I'm developing in my writing. One is called authoritarian power. Another one is regime-society relations. That's going to be the last part of the presentation. And I actually do talk about regime-society relations as a caveat to the Kazakh Spring book. And dictatorial vocabulary, something that, again, comes up a lot in my fieldwork. Okay, so let me start with a story. As I said, a good keynote is about storytelling. One of my interlocutors in one of the Central Asian countries once told me that as a child growing up in a dictatorship, in a post-Soviet dictatorship, they were always so used to the picture of the president that was on display literally everywhere. They said that they would see the president on the banners, in the daily newspapers, and even on the title page of the textbook when they just became a first grader at school. And so that experience of constantly seeing this familiar and smiling, aging dictator's face made my interlocutor think that the dictator, I'm not going to mention the country, but the dictator was the distant grandfather. And that's what they told me. There was something soothing and familiar in that old and easily recognizable smiling face. And he just said, they said, and this has just made sense, that the dictator, the president, is my distant relative. It's just the grandfather I never, learned to meet in person, but he is somebody who's very present in my life, so that he must be a distant relative. And then my interlocutor said, otherwise, why would the president be smiling from the portraits that followed me everywhere, from home to school in my daily life? They concluded. And I think this encounter stayed with me for a very long time because while I find myself in a torturous journey of writing, rewriting, crossing, deleting, and writing again the type of theory about the violence of authoritarian power, what I call authoritarian power, and how this authoritarian power can be very subtle, but often not subtle, in penetrating the everyday life of the citizens. So the experience of a first grader thinking that the smiling dictator is some sort of distant grandfather or distant family member is an incredibly violent encounter with what many scholars have called the everyday authoritarianism. Everyday authoritarianism is a very subtle and often normalized ways in which authoritarian control manifests in daily life of its citizens. It affects how people live, work, how they relate to the regime in both political and social spheres. And I believe that everyday authoritarianism is a tool, but also as a methodological context from which we start our fieldwork and from which we start, our interviews, focus groups, or even observations and ethnographies, is a very important concept to start understanding how citizens respond, negotiate, and often learn to live with their dictatorial projects or dictatorial regimes. And there's always something useful in noting down the mundane, but nevertheless very violent processes of living under a dictatorship. I first paid attention to the institutions and symbols of dictatorship. That's why my obsession with presidential portraits, banners, and things that I wrote about in my earlier paper on presidential portraits was so important for me. And I used to call this kind of like symbols and institutions of dictatorships authoritarian power in my field diaries. Authoritarian power is the type of power I try to conceptualize that often strips one of ability to speak, act, or resist to the authoritarian status quo that inevitably makes their life unbearable. But it also pushes them to adapt, no matter how strange it sounds, to adapt to the regimes and to survive the regimes they live under. So authoritarian power is connected or is part of the bad governance, widespread corruption, inequality, lack of social security. All of these things are synonymous with authoritarian power. And I believe that my interlocutors are very much aware of the fact that it's the authoritarian power that makes, all of these things, institutions not working or bribes being widespread, that then if you want to get somewhere, you have to bribe somebody. And they know that very, very clear, and they know that the problem lies with the regime and with the dictatorship. But unfortunately, not all of them are allowed to drop that word. In our conversations, and again, as a political sociologist, for me, these concepts make a lot of sense. I would speak of the regime when describing the type of power relationships that dictated our daily lives when I was in the field. But for my respondents, those were the prohibited words. So I had to delete the word authoritarian from my fieldwork diaries, and instead I was just writing the word A to identify for myself what I meant by that. And I had to delete the pronunciation of the word regime while I was in the field for a very long time. Because I knew that in this context, for the people who spoke to me, these words are too dangerous. These words could be landing them in a police station, or worse, making their lives even more unbearable under these conditions. So instead, they came up with different words. And again, I traveled across different Central Asian states, and there were varying degrees of the authoritarian power and how people felt this authoritarian power. So in certain places, people would speak of rais. In Uzbek or in Kazakh, rais is kind of like a chief. But rais is a very contextualized term because it's the chair of the mahala, and mahala is a type of community-led kind of governance, but it's appropriated by the regime. So there are official mahalas, and then there are real mahalas, right? So official mahala is where the rais or the chief is appointed directly by people from the regime. And the unofficial mahala, that's how my respondents defined it, is the real one where the community actually takes over the governance. And people learn to live in this parallel realities where there is in the state institution that is incredibly controlled, and where the official mahala can be used as a surveillance point to seed out all of these kind of resistances or critiques of the regime. And then the unofficial mahala is actually the one that makes life bearable in the community and where people live. It's usually in the neighborhood community. So if I was very lucky, stories followed with a sweet tea inside someone's home. But it was always behind closed doors and in the group where everyone had to trust each other. At first, these conversations would focus on recounting smaller problems, like small-scale bribes that one had to pay in order to get good health care, or just bribe somebody to get things done. But then my interlocutors would address the bigger, more systematic problem, that all power was concentrated in the hands of the dictator and his inner circle. And not everyone called this locus of power by the word of regime, again, even though I was working in this context in the post-Soviet, post-Krim of Uzbekistan, people were still not used to this word regime. But instead, they would come up with a lot of words that were not contradictory, but would often be used to mean the same thing. They would say the government, the president, sometimes even the state. And often these big words, again, in different languages, in Russian, in Uzbek, and sometimes in Tajik, they would all kind of make up like a very complex mixed story, but they all meant the same thing. They meant the power, right? They meant the decision-making apparatus. Sometimes people would be so, when they would be frustrated with something, with a big systematic problem of authoritarianism, they would just point with their hands to the direction of what they believe is the capital city. And they would just say, the problem is really in Tashkent or Astana. And sometimes when I would get very, very lucky, people in my other field site would whisper to me, the real problem is really in Ashgabat. But again, these people who were very critical of the regime would not, would try to mask this critique into something else, and they would try to use all sorts of words to not to talk about the regime as it is. So the constraints of doing fieldwork in authoritarian context often leaves researchers challenged by what is allowed and not allowed to discuss. So I had to divide my fieldwork with, for example, if I was doing focus groups or interviews or ethnographies with ordinary people, with people who did not have, backing, who were not activists and so on. I was just noting down things as they said, and I wouldn't follow up and say, like, do you really mean the state or do you mean the president? Because I knew that these questions would get people into trouble. But in other contexts, and again, I worked for a very long time on the project on political art and how political art can become a form of resistance to even the most dictatorial regimes, particularly in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. I found that speaking to artists, the people who create the type of visual language that can, resist the political language of the regime, was much easier. And sometimes I would go back, and thankfully I was really lucky to have that fieldwork. I would go back over years and interview the same artists I spoke to, and ask them, do you really mean the state or do you mean the regime? And from there, the concept of authoritarian power really came from, because artists create not only visual language, but they also conceptualize what they mean by the authoritarian power. So, in that sense, the work of Uzbek artist Aleksandr Barkovsky in the video art where he waltzes with the monument of Amir Timur, as you can see here, the medieval leader of Central Asia, who was very despotic, by the way, but also using this monument of a medieval leader who was the linchpin of Islam Karimov's dictatorial symbolism. And as some of my colleagues argued, was his cult of personality by proxy, was quite a telling experience of producing that video. And in the video, Barkovsky was not just waltzing with this very famous monument in Uzbekistan, but he was also constantly trying to overtake the monument, to say that, as a citizen, he was more powerful than the monument. But what happened in the video is that, very sort of rigid Amir Timur would constantly take him over, would constantly lead in the waltzing. And I think the title of the video art, Dancing with the Gods, or Dancing with the Inventing Gods, basically had a very bitter but also satirical critique that if you try to dance with these kind of authoritarian leaders, again, Karimov by proxy, Karimov's cult of personality by proxy, you never win. They constantly overtake you and they constantly overpower you. So in that sense, I think political art can be used as an excellent space of critiquing and ridiculing this form of authoritarian power. But essentially, authoritarian power for me is the type of disempowering effects of dictatorial politics on citizens, when citizens feel that they cannot even talk about things as they are, that they cannot call their dictators, or that they cannot talk about their present realities as life under a dictatorship. And this idea that it had to be spelled out differently is very, very important. But all of these things, again, you had to unravel them. You had to spend a long time discussing these things. You had to look for alternative symbols to understand this type of work and this type of feelings and emotions. But it also taught me a very important point that I stress throughout my work, that the resistance to authoritarian power starts with small stories. That it starts with mundane, everyday acts of resistance in creative approaches and standing up to the regime in ways the way people conceptualize and invent them. If it's video art, if it's an anecdote that people are willingly sharing about the political leader, we need to pay attention to these mundane and small instances. We also need to pay attention to the ways people talk about the regimes in different words, whether it's the state or government or majlis or something else, rais, mahala, the official mahala, and other examples are used. But we have to pay attention to this language and to the emotion people experience in relation to their regimes. We have to pay attention to the feelings and experiences that can be both contradictory and hard to understand, especially for somebody who comes from a democratic background. Every time I send something to my editor, it's kind of, or my copy editor, it's a tug of war because they don't understand what I'm writing about because, they've been living their whole lives under democratic context. But we need to understand that the relationship of citizens to their regimes is a very complex process, and it's a very multi-layered process where things are not as simple as sort of overpowering or fear, but things are a lot more complex, and people may experience different emotions connected to these specific regimes, and they can conceptualize different forms of resistance connected to that. But while I was doing this fieldwork, and again, this is the span of fieldwork that I've started doing after my PhD in 2015, and I visited all of the countries of Central Asia. I've been dealing with a lot of sort of paying attention to things I didn't pay attention maybe to when I was a grad student, when I was doing fieldwork for my dissertation. So I tried to recover every instance of the concept that was thrown at me, in mixed languages. Sometimes the conversations would be done in half Russian, half Kazakh, Uzbek, and then at some point I even started learning a little bit of Tajik. It didn't lead me anywhere, but I had a small dictionary, written dictionary, where I would put words in Tajik from the focus groups that my team in Tajikistan and I were conducting. And this vocabulary would slowly but surely, get filled up with certain words that I would never find in an official dictionary. Words like, for example, kulabi, kulob, kulobsky, from varying different kind of like languages from Tajik to Russian, this would change in pronunciation, but everything was going back to this kind of place, magical place, as my interlocutors often described it to me, called Kulob, which is basically a region in Tajikistan where the Tajik president Imam Ali Rahmon and his power men from his inner circles really come from. So at some point I was really intrigued to see this place where, as I said, my interlocutors and colleagues were saying anything is possible and where everything is happening. And Kulob, again, is like about 5-6 hours drive from Dushanbe, the capital city. So when we drove there, we didn't just stay in the Kulob city, we also went to something called Dangara. Dangara is a much smaller provincial town in the Kulob region. So there is a Kulob city, Kulob region, and then Dangara is the birthplace of Imam Ali Rahmon. And it's definitely a flourishing place. I mean, it's very, the development inside the city, inside the town was really, really beautiful. So my interlocutors who were not from Kulob, they were from different parts of Tajikistan, they half laughingly started taking a picture next to the Dangara sign at the entrance to the city. And they were telling me that this was the real locus of power in their country, and that's why they had to take this picture. But anecdotes aside, through these encounters and even smaller things, I was able to learn local dictatorial vocabulary. And that's the second concept I want to introduce, connected to the authoritarian power in many ways. Dictatorial vocabulary is, a system of different words, nicknames, and concepts that people create in authoritarian context in order to define the experiences of living under specific dictatorship. To avoid saying the prohibited words like the regime or dictator or authoritarianism, people acquired some other concepts that were widely shared. So everybody knew what Kulobsky means. You didn't need to explain it to a local, you only need to explain it to me. But they knew that these words that they were creating and sharing were less dangerous. Kulobsky is part of the common knowledge that people share in Tajikistan. There's nothing dangerous about saying that, oh, he's Kulabi or he's from Kulob and that's why he's, going up in his career. That goes without saying. It's almost like, a common sense practice. And, Kulabsky, and I started finding some sort of connections to my own dictatorial vocabulary because, again, as I say, I'm native of Kazakhstan, I'm still a citizen of Kazakhstan. And in my own country, I was also growing up to learn a particular dictatorial vocabulary. With us, it would, Kulabsky would transform into shaprashte, under Nazarbayev rule, or now Shaprashti turns into diplomatsky under the Tokayev rule, who built his career and his networks of trust in the foreign ministry. But when I say that, again, Shaprashti is a very specific group of people. It's kind of like tribal identity of our former president, Nursultan Nazarbayev. But when saying that, or when saying Kulabsky, I want to stem away from this understanding that it's all based on these blood ties, or that the network of trust and corruption in these inner circles of regimes have to be based specifically on ethnic or blood ties. Actually, the trust issue in these networks is a lot more important. People from different ethnicities and different religions or any other backgrounds can form part of what is diplomatsky or can form part of what is Kulobsky. You can marry into being Kulobian. You can, by allegiances become part of Kulobian even if you're not Tajik, for example. Or you can become Shaprashtinsi even if you're not from that particular tribe. So I want to stress the, this label of, I don't want to pronounce it, but this label that starts with C when it comes to Central Asia, it's often seen as this kind of like, deinstitutionalized, but also very specific type of trust networks that I don't believe are working out here. What works out here is more of the interest groups, right? But when this language exists, when this language of Shaprashte or Diplomatsky, when the nicknames for dictators in my country exist, so Nursultan Nazarbayev was often described as Nazik or Papa, right, the father of the nation and so on, in a very kind of like anecdotal or funny way. So people were ridiculing his status as the father of the nation by calling him Papa. But again, that shows the level of when certain things are allowed and when certain things are not allowed. But nevertheless, even in this dictatorial language, or dictatorial vocabulary, sorry, I think it works as a disempowering strategy, because when people talk about these things, when people talk about corruption by mentioning president's family, because they cannot call it widespread corruption, I think it's still very much disempowering, but at least it's the way of people relating and explaining and making sense of the realities that they live under, and being often critical of these realities as well. But in some of the contexts, again, going away from Kazakhstan, going to other countries where I traveled and conducted my fieldwork, I learned that you know, the level of freedom and the level of expression, even when it comes to anecdotes and funny things and memes especially, there are different ways of resistance. So my dictatorial vocabulary in Central Asia was constantly adding up not only verbal you know, instances, but also silences, omissions, pauses in conversations, and nonverbal body language, like speaking with your eyes, you know, when somebody is not winking, but actually sending you signals with your, I mean, scholars of Soviet dissidents would probably agree with me that they know what I'm talking about, speaking with your eyes when you're trying to silence down somebody. And sometimes when I wouldn't understand speaking with the eyes, somebody would pinch my knee under the table to kind of tell me that I need to shut up about things I was talking about when it came, again, to my very frivolous political sociologist understanding of regimes and dictatorships. And people would literally pinch me. And that was also part of the dictatorial vocabulary. That was also part of the tactic of communicating and explaining that we're all on the same page. You don't need to bring these words into being. But also it was the way of avoiding the type of violence that would transform into unpleasant visits from police, or even more unpleasant conversations with the present-day counterparts of the KGB forces. I still call them KGB because essentially it's the same institution. And these visits to the KGB offices where you would be yelled at, and I've experienced several of them, are not very pleasant. So that's what my interlocutors were trying to tell me with the eyes. Stop talking about it if you don't want to end up in that situation again. But I also think that silence is a form of violence, and I did debate a lot this issue with a lot of my interlocutors who said silence is a form of self-protection, but also silence is a form of violence. And it's the violence of authoritarian power and people that disempowers them and doesn't allow them to call things as they are. It's the violence, not in the similar sense of this coercion or, you know, getting arrested and stuff, but it's the violence that remains mundane, the violence that remains very totalizing in the everyday encounters, because you cannot speak up of things you experience, and you cannot talk about the trauma of living in an authoritarian state. And another violence term that I found in my authoritarian vocabulary that was shared across different spaces and regions was the word that probably many of you know, and it's the word Vlast. Right? And I remember making that turn and thinking I need to write about Vlast in my book about political activism, but it was a very difficult decision to do so. But I think Vlast is a very interesting concept because it's both quite ambiguous of what it means. Vlast translates from Russian simply as power, but I also translate it in my work as the political regime, or the authoritarian political regime. But when people in the interviews or in the focus groups would talk about Vlast, it also felt like they didn't need to explain what we were talking about. Even though I often told them that Vlast can be regional Vlast, you know, it can be the governor, Vlast can be somebody who's not even part of the political institution, but we all know he, because in dictatorial politics it's often he, that he's all in power and we cannot criticize him in this particular region and so on. For example, if somebody is not part of the political institution, but is a very well-known member of the trusted networks of the regime. And I, you know, the more I started looking into this, obviously, a lot of scholars have written about it. I think Karen Davisha's words in her quite influential 2014 book about the genealogy of what she calls Putinomania, and she's an expert on Putinomania, is very, very intriguing, and I really like this quote where she says that the key to Putin's political authority is not so much about the law, but is Vlast, or power. So she translated here as power. Courses of action might be taken not because there are strict rules and regulations, but because there is an unwritten understanding, or понятие, another word in our dictatorial vocabulary, about how things must be done. It is clear that even before his presidency, Putin sought to be at the center of a tribute system that would determine which Russian elites would get a seat at the privatization table and on what terms, end quote. Right? So Vlast is, again, this kind of like logic of the regime, logic of how things are done, but also Vlast is how people speak about this origin or the logic of the regime. Alena Ledeneva, another scholar of Russian politics and society, and my new colleague at UCL, contributed also a lot of entries to that dictatorial vocabulary. She talks about telefonное право, система, вертушка, силовики. Again, all of these concepts that are very, very well known to people who work with post-Soviet context, who work with Putinist Russia. Siloviki in particular, I think it's another word that travels across different contexts, and we can talk about Siloviki even in Central Asia. Vertushka, I don't think so much because it's a very Kremlin-based invention, but still I think it's a very interesting expansion of the vocabulary. But I want to stress a little bit more on Vlast, because Vlast is such an important concept for my interlocutors, both the people who don't want to protest because they feel that, you know, they have their reasons to not to protest, but also both my interlocutors who are active in opposition and who are fighting for the democratization. And for both of these groups, it's a very important concept because Vlast, you can say Vlast without saying the regime. You can say Vlast and you know that you're critiquing the dictatorship. But also at the same time, as my interlocutors among the political activists of the Kazakh Spring, Kazakh Oktyaby, as it is known in Kazakhstan, would say, Vlast is really disempowering you, because if you say Vlast, you're giving into the idea that there is nothing you can do. Vlast is so omnipresent and so omnipotent that there is nothing you can break or penetrate. Vlast is a concept. So one of my respondents, political artist and an activist, Medina Bazargali, used to say that we need to stop calling the regime elites the Vlast, because that's the first step to resist it. When we reconceptualize what Vlast means to us, that's how we can fight against it. So, yeah, and again, I think it's a very divisive concept in that sense, because to a lot of people, it's both empowering or disempowering at the same time. And Vlast is a concept of regime-society relationship that I talk about in the book and that I develop in my ongoing writing. So, and it stems from this idea that as, you know, as a scholar of politics, I do understand that there is a state-society relation, something that Jennifer was talking about earlier this morning. But state-society relationship exists as this type of, you know, what's it called? The authority that the society can claim from the state on its governance, but it only can exist in a democratic context. And when we transforming to the very sort of highly authoritarian context in which I was working and in which I conducted a lot of my field work, we can see that the state-society relations does not exist in the way that it exists in democracies, but also at the same time that it transforms into something else. And that's why for me, bringing up the regime-society relations was a lot more useful of a concept to talk about. So in regime-society relationship, the regime occupies the state. So state becomes this ambiguous term that people talk about, государство, state, you know, Yale, for example, in different languages. But it's something very abstract, that is something that is out there. People do not really have authority to fight for the power and decision-making within the state. But what they can do is that they can speak up to the regime. And there are different tactics of how the citizens can speak up to the regime. They can come and occupy presidential, you know, the squares next to the presidential palaces, as mothers, protesting mothers did in Kazakhstan, demanding better welfare payments, for example, in 2019. They can, as you can see here from Nisikpuy Uyabayeva's example, I use in the book as well, they can use the portraits of the president. Her house was supposed to be demolished, and she covered her house with 91 posters of President Nazarbayev portraits, and that helped her not to get the house demolished. But also it's very symbolic. 91 posters means 1991 as the year of independence. You know, I know of other instances of how people can respond to these things. And protest and the formation of social movements under autocratic regimes becomes another form of speaking back to the regime and shaping the regime policies through these very sort of acts of disobedience that also can lead to incredible acts of repression from the police. But this is to say that in the authoritarian context, the regime is responding and is forming specific relations to the society. And again, in this framework, I'm trying to explain, it's an ongoing work, that the society can also speak back to the regime. So it's not a one-way direction, right? The society can find ways to, for example, petition, find ways for small-scale, resistant small-scale protests that basically bring very slow but some sort of change to their context. And and regime-society relations create parts of the dictatorial vocabulary. It creates and sustains the authoritarian power that disempowers people or disempowers citizens. Because in this relationship, regime is interested in staying, on top and being dominant of people's imagination. So, what do we need to do in order to overcome? This basically equation where it's a complex way of relating, responding, and coexisting with authoritarian regime. What is basically the change? So the people, the political activists, so stemming a little bit away from the everyday authoritarianism and looking more into the actual change that is possible. The political activists I interviewed for Kazakh Spring book were talking about the democratization is only possible if we uproot the system that regime-society relationship established. It's the system and it's the belief system where citizens believe that it's not the state that is the ultimate power, and it's not them who are an authority to change what is happening in that state, but it's the regime. So everything I spoke about before, especially the dictatorial vocabulary, the understanding of Vlast, the use of authoritarian power and how people respond to it. It's all part of this relationship, right? It's all part of the fact that people construct the sense that the regime is there almost forever, and in a lot of contexts that's how it feels, that it's a never-ending authoritarian regime, and that it creates its own ways of normalizing the specific authoritarian status quo where people often feel disempowered and unable to change this idea. And so the activists or the political forces that try to resist that say that the only way to start democratizing is to bring back the state, bringing back the understanding that citizens have to, that the decision-making and the regimes have to be accountable, fully accountable to the expressions and interests of the society. So it's reverting the regime-society relations back into the state-society relationship. But why is this last concept that I really want to stress on is so important? It's because, again, it binds, regime-society relations binds together the authoritarian power I spoke about before, and it binds together the way citizens form their response to the authoritarian regime. And it's often, the regimes spend a lot of time in this visualization of language because they need to create a totalizing sense that the regime is there forever, that the president or that the ruler is there, is the only locus of power. That's why it's always centered on him and on his words, as you can see, slogans and stuff. And the citizens themselves become really small components of that, but they constantly have to experience the totalizing effect of that everyday authoritarianism that is often expressed through these portraits and through this understanding that it's only the only power here, the only Vlast here, is the one that is embodied by the dictator himself. Right? And in some instances, even the dualization of two presidents or the two Vlast can be there. So Vlast is very plural in that sense. And I think I want to end on a hopeful note that there is, ways to change that. And I think that the change in this particular context where everything is so incredibly, not monolithic, but it's so incredibly interconnected because regime-society relations takes a long time to construct, but it's a very much binding contract between the citizens and the regime, right? Where the citizens have to become obedient, where the citizens have to sustain this idea that they cannot change everything, and the regime constantly just penetrates that idea further. I think the way to change that, and that's what the Kazakh Spring activists really taught me, is to radically reimagine that relationship, to reimagine that it's not the regime that is locus of power, it's something else, and radically reimagine the political future that is possible. So what they were doing with all of these slogans, the movement emerged as an angry response to the fact that regime transition happened in Kazakhstan between Nazarbayev and Tokayev in 2019 when President Nazarbayev stepped down voluntarily after 30 years of uncontested rule, and then gave the presidency, gave the power in the country to his successor that he handpicked himself, and who essentially built the system when Nazarbayev was still the dictator, but he was the retired dictator. It's a very strange context of what happened, but it was a very for the first years, it was a very successful dictatorial transition. only the picture perfect was spoiled by the small groups of grassroots of protests that grew exponentially within a few months, and within the few months of the spring, that grew into widespread electoral protests in June 2019 when Tokayev was formally elected as the next president, that grew into widespread, beyond just the capital city, beyond Almaty, beyond big cities, sort of movements movements of angry citizens that were saying, why are you deciding our decisions for us? And I think the slogan, again, that's why language is so important. That's why this mundane, kind of a discursive approach is so important. The slogan here reads, "Наша свобода сильнее всех тюрем." Our freedom is much stronger than all of the prisons. That radical reimagination, going from this very disempowering understanding of, Vlast, we cannot really change here. Dangara is a place where everything is happening, and that's the real locus of power. Going from that to our freedom is stronger than all of your prisons, or to the slogan that the peaceful rallies should not require should not require permit. Thank you. That slogan, even though it seems so simple for a democratic context, was crucial and revolutionary for the context in the country where people did not rally for a very long time. And it really changed the political culture and political imagination. Another slogan that I think touched a lot of people was the slogan over here. And again, in Central Asia, Russian is part of the discourse. I just wanted to include mostly posters in Russian, but there were a lot of posters in Kazakh and other languages that basically showed that there was an interplay of different things. But Kazakhstan without Nazarbayevs, not just single Nazarbayev, but Nazarbayevs, which both indicate, for example, his corrupt family, but also indicate that the regime is expandable. And even if you get rid of one dictator, it means that the system is out there through the regime-society relationship, that there will be another Nazarbayev or multiple Nazarbayevs in 5 years' time. So this idea of civic engagement and completely radically reimagining political culture and how it could be constructed, I think is an important story of what happened in Kazakhstan and what culminated in, unfortunately, a very violent crackdown of the 2022 protests. But seeing how from a very small incentive to change the paradigm, to change the discursive paradigms, to give people new type of political language, and then extrapolating to 3 years later and having a widespread country-based, incredibly angry protest because people felt like we are not the authority here, you're not listening to us. And I think to me the 2022 protest was, January 2022 protest, was very much this idea that, bringing back the state-society relations in a very violent way, unfortunately, because the protest was co-opted by violent groups and they kind of stole the story from the peaceful protesters. But that idea that through radical reimagination, through provision of the radically different future, we can go back to the idea that the state belongs to people and that the regime is simply, and I put it in the book, that the regime is simply occupying the state like a cancerous cells metastasizing on a healthy body. So that particular perspective and bringing that and fighting against all of these very overpowering concepts of authoritarian power and dictatorial vocabulary, I think is the way to break through the dictatorial violence of normalization of authoritarian rule. I will stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for thought-provoking presentation. I believe that there is a number of responses and reactions from the audience. So let's proceed in such a way that there will be some voices from the floor, and then I will give an opportunity to Diana to respond. Please raise your hands. We'll proceed from this side to that side, from left to the right to me. Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, I'm here. Yeah, my name is Julia Gataulina. I'm from Tampere University here in Finland. Thank you very much, Diana, for your talk. I have a short question, maybe more methodological one, even though, yeah, of course, I appreciated the political argument that you're making as well. But then I was wondering, because in the beginning of your presentation, you were saying that your research was like to conceptualize together with the Central Asians or with the Ukrainians here more, with the Central Asians. But then you talked a lot about also silences and omissions and whatever is there in the dictatorial vocabulary. So I was wondering, did you have any methodological challenges? How would you interpret or conceptualize with people if there are silences and absences? How do we do the theoretical work and political work with them, in the absence of words and conceptualization put forward very strongly by people in the field? Thank you.
Thank you. Then there was someone on the back. Yeah, please, and then.
This one, right? My name is Valeria. Diana, thank you very much for your presentation, and especially these little stories, how people use the vocabulary. And I think it's very interesting to see about this state-society of relations, but my question would be, did you have a chance during your field work to look more into how the political activists, or the people who oppose the regime, also interact probably with other groups in the society? Because I suppose that there are also groups who probably support the regime, right? Or they're not oppositional and neutral. And how does it work with this vocabulary that political or oppositionally minded groups use? And how this probably not trusting works with other groups? Because probably it's also another level of power relations and unequal relations that people have inside the society, not only with the institutional level.
Okay, then, gentleman in the front row, can you give a mic? Yeah.
Thank you. Igor Mikeshin, University of Helsinki. Fascinating talk, thank you. I was willing to ask you about the mortality of dictators. So this is quite a fascinating topic, as I see it, because when, for instance, historically, when Stalin died or one of the Kims died, it came almost as a surprise that these people can actually die. So, and on the other hand, when the war in Ukraine started, many people, probably naively enough, discussed that the death of Putin would be one of the solutions for the war in Ukraine. So is it a part of a narrative at all? Or maybe not dying physically, but politically, like stepping down? Thank you.
Diana, would you like to respond? You can respond to the first three questions, and then there will be an opportunity for another three questions. Yeah?
Thank you so much. These are all fascinating questions. Thank you for the desk question, because I'm really intrigued by that one as well. To Valeria's question, to Julia's question on silences, I think and I didn't mention that a lot of my work is very ethnographic, so it takes a long time to build trust with people and not to abuse that trust. I've been really, really careful not to tease out words from people, because I know that, not only that would make them uncomfortable and it's unethical, but also it's incredibly dangerous to speak up of things. And that's why I intentionally did not call out certain countries that I conducted fieldwork in. But I think after a certain time, when you develop a but trusted enough conversations, people were joking often, that I'm a dangerous person because I'm a political sociologist. And I think that joke stuck with me, and that's when I started understanding how my discipline really defines me. But I had very long discussions with certain artists who said that silence is a form of political activism, and they said that just because we're silent doesn't mean that we, politically apathetic. It's actually our active political position that we need to be silent. So I don't know, and we debated a lot about that conversation, because this was a very trusted person, and I trusted them and they trusted me. And another context, I think we need to give a lot of credit to our interlocutors, because they're incredibly smart people. And I traveled across different classes, different genders. My fieldwork was very multi-layered, and yeah, I think people who live and endure these and survive these dictatorial contexts crushing dictatorial contexts are incredibly wise, and we need to learn from them. So even when they were silent, after some time, they would be able to tell me why the silence was there, or their friends or the people who experienced similar things would be able to do that. But yeah, I think, and I'm trying to give them as much space in the text to do that, and to show the agency. To Valeria, yes, and through the regime-society relations, I was conscious that I'm running out of time, and I hope I didn't rumble at the end, but basically it's this idea that a lot of people develop very distinct relationships to the regime, right? And some of them are devoted regime politicians. In the book, I have a whole chapter on the policemen, and there's like a trial of an activist, and how the policemen who are, I forgot the legal word, but they basically wrote, they said that the woman activist beat them up at the rally, which was the other way around, obviously. But they were the claimants or something. Forgive me for missing the legal language. My best friend is a legal scholar, but I don't know how it's called. And basically the way they would expressing their devotion to the regime, literal devotion in that court hearing, was very, very intriguing to watch, and to do that digital ethnography of that hearing, because it was on Zoom during the pandemic. And just seeing how the prosecutor general and everybody was just like, saying, how could you even think of going against Nazarbayev? He's such a great person. He built this whole country from the scratch and so on. So there are devoted people. And those divisions, they exist. And I'm trying to pay equal attention to the vocabularies that devoted people create, and the vocabularies that people who are critical of the regime create. Talking about the interests, I'm co-writing a paper with my colleague on this idea of people who try to gain something from the regime. We call it entitlement. But people who willingly want to be part of the corrupt system because they think that the regime needs to pay them something. So we're trying to conceptualize that as well. And to Igor, yes, of course, in Central Asia, there are cases of dictators who died not accidentally, but surprisingly in office. And I'm writing a paper about one of them and how people commemorate his death date and his birthday till today, even though it's been many, many years since he died. And I'm really intrigued by this kind of like haunted approach of why people still feel very, feel a range of very interesting emotions reminiscing his death. And for me, this is a very interesting and a very deeply conceptual space as well to go into, and looking into death and what happens to the afterlife of dictators. But none of them had political deaths apart from Nazarbayev. That's a precedent.
Yeah, we have an opportunity for one more question. Yes.
Thank you very much. I feel so privileged.
Sorry, could you please pass the mic to the next row?
Not me.
No?
Can we manage 2 questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Diana. My name is Elina Trashchenko. I'm from University of Bergen. I really loved your talk, especially this idea of radical reimagination of political power and also the vocabulary of authoritarianism. But I was wondering, do you also use concept of vocabulary of resistance, and how then eventually the vocabulary of resistance relates to vocabulary of authoritarianism? And the second question is about the aftermath of violent repressions after the acts of resistance. What happens with this vocabulary and the dynamics there? Is still used, or how does it change, or what happens with that? Thank you.
It will be very short. Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you very much. It was indeed very interesting to hear your story about this region, but I couldn't stop myself but feeling a big déjà vu. And I was asking myself, because I remember that 20 years ago, after Jurchak's book was published, which I think very relevant to your analysis, we actually discussed all these ideas of the language of the dictatorship and the complex relationship between the
Could you briefly formulate your question?
To the last Soviet generation and this historical moment. So my question is, what is different today? What is different in your region and in this time in history and in this type of authoritarian regime? Because it should be. So what actually, how you add to this analysis and what we already know and knew about the late Soviet authoritarian regimes and the resistance to it?
Okay, it's hard to respond briefly, but please.
To Alina's question, because we're friends, we can discuss it later, but also Vocabulary of Resistance is the whole book of Kazakh Spring. I tried to give a very detailed space to that. And post-trauma and repressions, I hate to do reclama or advertising of my next book, but that's why I write about, it's called The Long Post-January, and it's basically the traumatic experience of people after tortures and everything, that we still live in the long post-January. For us, it never ended. And I tried to conceptualize it there. And for Jurčak's book, of course, I've read it and contemplated on it. I think it was also criticized, but I find value in his elegant narrative, much more elegant than my speech probably today, so I apologize. But what is different? I think the post-Soviet dictators, and I'm using it here very critically because post-Soviet to me is exactly the continuation of very Soviet practices. Post-Soviet dictators were really, really good students of Soviet repressive and authoritarian politics. And actually, I think I have this quote somewhere that they got all the A pluses on Stalinism and how to be like Stalin. But I think it's hybridized. It's definitely, even if they took certain institutions like KGB, surveillance, co-opting and so on and so forth, I think they hybridized in the context of post-independence because we're still talking about state and nation state, and independence is very important here. I should have conceptualized more on the context of state, because to the regimes and to the dictators that I'm talking about, the state is the biggest value. They need to own the state. They need to penetrate the state fully. And I think they're doing it differently than the Soviet power did, because Soviet obviously was a very different animal. And I think lastly, because again, the Kazakh Spring book is dedicated to the digital activism, right? It's my editor really wanted to highlight this in the subtitle. We have to pay attention to the digital. I think inevitably, the fact that Instagram became such a huge political force for the Kazakh Spring people to completely change the dynamic of how regime-society relations operated. And if you think about it, Instagram, people say, you buy your cosmetics from Instagram because somebody influenced you. You look for gossip about celebrities on Instagram, not political activism. But in certain places, it can be incredibly politicized. And I think that's what the late Soviet dissidents never have imagined, that would become a huge tool against the regime.
Yeah, thanks so much for excellent presentation. Thanks for your active engagement, and